child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and he left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. Really quick, can you hit record? Thanks. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, he took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he had heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. The Lord add a blessing to his word. I just want to acknowledge just some difficulties really quick in this text that I'm not going to actually get to this morning. So we just read about a full infanticide. So Herod, just destroyed, killed. And there's a lot of really great things you can read. Sorry, I shouldn't say great. There's a lot of things you can read about this particular incident in both biblical things and extra biblical sources, about how it happened, the kind of person Herod was. And there's just a lot of detail there. And I want to acknowledge that it did happen. And I'm not going to spend most of my time on that this morning, but I just know that it's there. So I lead with that because every time I preach a sermon, I always write at the top of my page. It's always hard to get to start writing, it's like, oh, what am I going to say? But I always just have a question, and it's, what is the good news in this text? And you read a passage like this, and I have to ask, what is the good news in this text? Because it's just a difficult passage about refugees, about traveling in times of year that were really tough for a family with nothing, going across borders and then back across borders, and there's a lot of pain and tragedy. So there's a lot happening in this passage, and it's difficult to find the good news, but I do think there is some. So last week we left off with the visit of the Magi, these astrologers who have traveled from afar to pay witness and homage to Christ and his holy family. And King Herod, who was threatened by this child to be at the center of the world, and because he wasn't, he had some plans of his own. So Herod represents the kind of power that will do whatever is necessary to keep it. Herod's power was rooted in the fear of losing it, in the insecurity of not knowing his place in relation to Christ, in relation to God. He got things mixed up. He knew that the place that he wanted was for his world to revolve around him, and if anything was going to threaten that illusion of that place, because it is an illusion, it doesn't really revolve around Herod, does it? He would use his power to push, shove, and stomp, and in this case, kill family members, which we have records of, and these infants. But here's the thing. Was King Herod actually ever a threat to the Messiah, to the Savior of the world? Was not his sense of place more of an illusion as it related to Jesus? So here's what I'm getting at. So sometimes we get trapped in the idea that we are at the center of the world. Are you with me? And we fall into the mindset where our spirits actually get a little corrupted, confused maybe, and they cause us to lose focus of what's most important, keeping Christ at the center. A pastor friend of mine, his name is Mike Erie, and I just love him. He We kind of grew up with him. He's really influential on my thinking. And I remember he did this sermon once, and it was called "Keep the Main Thing the Main Thing." Keep Christ at the center. It's not very complicated. And so, what God did through Christ exposed who Herod was. The text tells us that he was frightened. Does the Spirit frighten us? The Spirit doesn't frighten us. So Christ shows up in the world, and he wants to bring life where there's death. He wants to bring light where there is darkness, and it's all wrapped up in this scandal of grace and forgiveness, right? Are you with me? It's so good. So Jesus was and always will be a threat to the established order of things. And that's exactly what Herod was. When the established order of things gets disrupted by those at the bottom or those on the margins, it seems history tells us that those in power like to double down. Who knows what the double down is? The double down. The double down is when a person thinks that they have the advantage and is willing to do or bet on their current strategy that they'll win. And they almost intensify their efforts. And in this case, Herod had some pretty unforgivable strategies to take out this newborn king, right? So I think the movement of Jesus, the birth of Christ, is offensive to Herod and a threat to his power because it forces Herod to have to choose, to have to shift his focus between himself and Christ. There can't be two kings. I mean, there's the earthly king that some of them think they're their king, but there can't be two kings of the world, kings of the universe, kings of the cosmos. And Herod doesn't want to accept this reality of Christ. He wants to have his whole world without Christ. And so I'm writing this and I'm like, well, some might say, well, I'm not Herod because I'm not a king. But isn't it true that sometimes we think we're kings, forgetting to keep Christ as king? We get things mixed up, right? Yeah, sure, we may not be in charge of a whole nation, but we still have this small little world where we think we're the center at times, right? Are you with me? I know I do. Could it be that maybe we have lost the kingship aspect of Jesus and have decided to tame Jesus into a king who wanted to usher in comfort and security for those who follow him? So maybe we have missed him, and I know I have, we've missed Jesus as this firebrand radical who turned the established order upside down. So Herod couldn't have known exactly how Jesus was going to undo this order that Herod had. But he certainly was afraid enough and threatened enough of his own place and his own insecurity that he figured he would do something, and that's the double down. So Herod he tried to keep his established order. He tried to keep his own little world together, right? And not have Christ as the king. And here's the thing. We always have the choice to choose Christ. Mary chose Christ. Joseph chose Christ. The Magi chose Christ. Magi, these travelers who were looking at the stars, chose Christ. The shepherds chose Christ. But Herod chose himself and his nation. We always have the choice to choose Christ. So now, Joseph and Mary, they leave Bethlehem. Actually, let me do a quick check-in. Anything right there? I always like to ask, is there anything stirring, anything curious, a question, a thought that you're like, oh, what about that? Yeah. Narcissist, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Thanks, brother. Anybody else? Yeah. Mm. Yeah, that's good. Anybody else? I love the communal sermon, obviously. So if there's anything else, go for it. Yeah. good. Yeah, that small. Yeah, I love that. There was someone else who raised their hand. No one else. Okay. Oh yeah, Emily. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks for that insight. Well, we'll keep stirring. See what else is curious. So Joseph and Mary, they leave Bethlehem because they're warned in a dream to get up and take the child and head to Egypt. So a few things about their travels to Egypt. Okay, so the angel tells them to escape to Egypt, and then right at the end he says, "Remain there until I tell you otherwise." Or some translations will say, "Stay there until been given different directions, I guess, by a different angel, a different messenger." So Egypt plays a significant role in the life of Jews. If we think about the Exodus account of the Israelites are essentially enslaved to the Egyptians for 430 years. Think about how many generations of people that is. Year after year, decade after decade, generation upon generation, turning into centuries of the idea that your identity is that you are the property and labor force of Egypt. So being slaves in Egypt meant you were the producer and the manufacturer of bricks. You laid brick and mortar. You just did this day in and day out. So your motto is, I exist to make bricks for the bondage of my master. 430 years of that. Then during the Exodus account, what we see in the book of Exodus, the account tells us the Israelites are liberated, right? So they're escaped from their bondage. They went from thinking of their identity as being slaves who exist to produce to being liberated actually as human beings, for being actually seen as made in the fullness of the image of God. That's a big shift. That takes probably generations and generations to undo. Probably more than generations and generations. It just goes on. So the angel of the Lord tells them to go to Egypt. So this is the backstory. And so he says, stay there, remain there until I tell you otherwise. Hold on a second. Angel, you want us to do what? You want us to go back to that? That's what's in their mind. This was the place. I mean, Jews celebrate Passover to remember their liberation from that. Today, still, you want us? We are either going to be chased by this maddening King Herod, who's a Jew and is threatened by a baby, or you want us to leave all that to go to Egypt, back to that place that is like part of our ancestral, just awful experience. And you want us to go with the baby and we have nothing and we're being chased by this madman, and God says, go to Egypt. And I have to ask, isn't the question that they might have, isn't there another option? How many times does God ask of us to do something and we go, isn't there another option? Isn't there another way to do this? The text tells us that Joseph got up and took Mary and the child by night, approximately 50 miles, probably a little more, from Bethlehem to the border of Egypt. I'm not sure how far in Egypt they went. So isn't it possible that God might ask us, his people, to do something that doesn't actually make sense? I don't think it would have made sense to them to say, go to Egypt. I mean, I know they were running for their lives from this guy, but to go there, come on, anywhere else. And isn't that the work of God and the Holy Spirit, to ask us to do things, to travel somewhere, to speak, to pray, to sleep, to forgive a friend, to run from something, to face something, to stand up against something that might seem contradictory to what we think is best? It goes back to our world. We think our world sometimes is the best. And God has this other idea of like, nope, actually, this is what I want you to do. And yet we have to ask the question, isn't there another option? Are you with me? So Joseph and Mary didn't have much time to decide. And I wonder how Mary and Joseph had to rely, to be fully dependent on God to get through those most difficult, painful circumstances. And that's where God does some of his best work, right? When he asks When God asks his people to do something that seems completely like out of the ordinary, out of sight, or sorry, out of the ordinary, that doesn't make sense to us. I mean, I think that's faith. I think that's trust. I think that's the belief that that still small voice for Mary and Joseph that guided their ancestors, the voice of the Spirit that guided them through their most troubling times, was that same voice that I think guided them and told them to do something that probably didn't make a lot of sense to them. Wait, you want us to go back to Egypt? But that is the place where all that other stuff happened. I don't want to say another word. But what I have to ask the question then, what about the gospel makes sense? We go back to that first question. What is the good news? I mean, does Jesus born in a stable make sense? Does a virgin birth make sense? Does grace or forgiveness or liberation or redemption or forgiveness of sins make sense? Does it make sense that the most powerful king of the most powerful kingdom in the world at that time was threatened by a baby born to an unwed mother who's called the Messiah? Makes sense? It doesn't. But I think that's what makes all of the Jesus story so compelling and right and true. It's good news because it's not like anything else. It subverts power. It tells us to do something that it seems completely contradictory, that it's otherworldly. We can't explain it. The story is good news because it's not predictable, or it's not boring, it's not explainable. We have ways to explain things. That's science. But God does unexplainable things, things that aren't boring and not predictable, and they walk us into all kinds of weird spaces. Are you with me? If the things God asked of us were predictable and boring and explainable, we might want to reconsider if they are indeed good news. And I'm not saying that like everything God asks of us is like this grand or some radical thing. I think it happens in our everyday ordinary lives. I mean, I think there's moments in our lives where there's big movements where we're like, okay, God's asking me to do this big thing. But I think it's the day-to-day choice of Christ where God's like, actually, I want you to go do that. It's that like nudge where you're like, oh, really? Isn't there another option? Some of it's big though. Some of it's huge. Some of it feels life-threatening to us. And we ask, isn't there another option? And so it's like, I don't know, I'm just wrestling with this. Lord, you want me to do what? Go where? Meet with who? You want me to quit that? Or you want me to retire and move over there? Right now, when you want me to remain here, you want me to stay. That's a whole nother thing. You want me to stay when things seem like they're falling apart, when things seem like they're in despair? You want me to stand up against who? I mean, that is like full reliance on the Holy Spirit. So I think the writer of this gospel is trying to tell us that the God who walked this earth in flesh did it in the most unexpected way in the midst of pain and suffering and tragedy. And God said, I'm with you. And so, church, I invite you to choose Jesus once again the way Mary and Joseph and the Magi did. And I invite you to reconsider maybe a tamed, nice suburban Jesus that we might have, that we might be following, and ask ourselves, is it the real thing?